It's February 20th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. Starting with a massive walkout by doctors. Doctors at the 5 big hospitals here in Seoul have walked off the job as of 6 a.m. this morning, as they had warned, in opposition to the government's plan to add 2,000 to the medical school enrollment quota next year. The government has activated emergency medical care mode and also warned of the revocation of the license of 2 individuals at the executive branch of Korea Medical Association. Alexei Navalny's widow Yulia vowed to continue his work to fight for a free Russia, while accusing the authorities of hiding her husband's body. The US and the EU are considering additional sanctions on Russia. The US has drafted a UN Security Council resolution calling for a temporary ceasefire in the Gaza Strip as soon as practical. The draft also warns Israel not to launch a ground offensive in Rafah. Doctors at 5 big hospitals here in the capital have stopped working as of early this morning over school admission seats. Now, troubles that patients will face appear to be inevitable. Our An Sung-jin is at one of the hospitals. Sung-jin, lead us through the latest.
Good morning, Tommy. I'm standing in front of Severance Hospital in Sinchon, Seoul, where trainee doctors have staged a walkout starting from 6 a.m. this morning. Now, this hospital is one of South Korea's big 5 hospitals, where more than 20% of the total number of trainee doctors work. These walkouts are in protest of a government policy which aims to increase the quota of medical school places by 2,000 places starting from next week. Doctors' groups argue that increasing the number of doctors would lead to unnecessary medical care on top of a lack of incentives for doctors to practice in essential areas such as pediatrics and emergency medicine. But health authorities said more doctors are vital to keep up with the country's fast-aging population. The number of doctors in the country relative to the size of the population is reportedly among the lowest in the developed world. As these trainee doctors play a key role in medical processes, it's expected to bring many difficulties for patients as surgery schedules have already been adjusted. As at this hospital behind me, there are usually nearly 2,000 surgeries scheduled each week. As walkouts begin today after the mass resignations of trainee doctors, the Korea Medical Residents Association announced that it will hold an emergency meeting starting at noon today, which is in 3 hours from now on, to further discuss responses.
But the government is also staying just as stern as the doctors, urging them to continue caring for parents. Sung-jin, how is the government dealing with their absences then?
About 400 emergency medical institutions nationwide will be monitored 24 hours a day from the National Medical Center. If the gap due to a lack of necessary doctors remains for a longer period, the government also announced that it will start non-face-to-face treatments.
There are 12 military hospitals where emergency rooms are operating. We have also decided to open them to civilians.
Now, the government has maintained its position, refusing to accept doctors' demands and denouncing their collective action as intolerable. It is said that President Yoon said that the medical community cannot defeat the people. The Yoon administration has sent a prior notice to key figures such as the chairman of the Emergency Response Committee of the Korea Medical Association regarding the suspension of their doctor's license. Whether this will be taken as a warning to the medical community will be something to watch out for. That's all I have for you. Back to you, Dami.
All right, Sung-jin, thank you for that coverage. Now, moving on. From tackling the low birth rate to finalizing electoral districts, clashes on key issues between the rival parties are expected. As this February's extraordinary session kicked off this week at the National Assembly, our political correspondent Lee Si-hoo reports.
On Monday, South Korea's National Assembly held an opening ceremony recognizing the start of the 21st Assembly's last extraordinary session. The Speaker of the Assembly, Kim Jin-pyo, in his opening remarks said that it's time for a change.
We are in desperate need of politics that can give new hope and courage to the people. We need to create a National Assembly that overcomes the crisis and prepares for the future.
Speaker Kim said these last 3 months of the 21st Assembly are its last chance for its, quote, heyday, and vowed to do his utmost best until the very last day. He also highlighted that the assembly and the administration should work to tackle the country's low birth rate. One way to do so, he says, is through a constitutional amendment.
If we respond to core causes of the low birth rate, such as childcare, education, and housing issues by identifying them as national tasks in the Constitution, then we will be able to gain people's trust.
Meanwhile, floor leaders of the main opposition Democratic Party and the ruling People Power Party will give speeches to the assembly on Tuesday and Wednesday, respectively. From Thursday to Friday, the assembly will question the government. A plenary session is scheduled for next week where the parliament will discuss pending issues. One of them, finalizing electoral districts for the upcoming election in April. With less than 2 months to go until the 22nd general election here in South Korea, fierce talks and clashes are expected between the ruling and opposition parties during this February extraordinary session. Lee Si-hu, Arirang News.
South Korea's central bank has held its policy rate steady at 3.5% for an entire year. And another rate freeze appears to be on the way this week for the 9th straight time. Let's turn to Professor Song Soo-young for more. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Is another 3.5% rate freeze the most likely scenario? I mean, is the continued slowdown in the inflation rate not enough?
Yeah, as long as the disinflation continues, we anticipate the Bank of Korea should reduce the interest rate because years ago, the chairman of BOK has preemptively increased the interest rate before the Federal Reserve in U.S. has increased the federal funds rate. So in that, to be coherent, in order to remain coherent, I think in Korea, South Korean economy has suffered so much from some declining GDP growth rate. Clearly, in the last year, we have seen that 1.3% of the GDP growth rate is really impressively weak. So, which means even though it has recorded a positive growth rate, still it is in some kind of very close to recession situation. So they have to consider to support the economy to grow, to put the economy in the track of growing faster or higher than the 1% of percentage growth rate. Of course, they expect 2.3% growth rate for their upcoming year, in 2024, but still it is not enough. So I hope the interest rate to be reduced sooner.
Right, Professor Song, I do have to point out South Korea's consumer inflation slowed to a 6-month low last month. But the finance minister, Choi Sang-mok, noted inflation might rebound to around 3% in February this month and also next month. Is that how it's looking now?
Yeah, clearly there is some uncertainty about the war which was waged by Israel, the invasion of Gaza. But however, this morning I have seen that it is also reported that the United States, they call upon some Security Council to step in and rein in the invasion of Israel to block Israel from engaging war in Gaza and the spreading out in the Middle East and worldwide. So that signal indicates that the United States may not allow Israel from spreading and increasing the war and spreading out and the negative impact on the world economy. So to that regard, I don't think much of a threat will be upcoming for the inflation, and the U.S. and the EU and other countries make an effort to stabilize the geopolitical situation in Middle East, and that will be accomplished.
Well, speaking of concerns and uncertainties, there are voices of concern that caution about the so-called last mile. Is this a concern really at this moment?
Yeah, I think I heard that is proposed by the Schnabel, the member of the European Central Bank, Isabel Schnabel. But I think it is a little bit inappropriate metaphor to describe the current situation, because the last mile implies that there is a finish line. So 2% of interest, 2% inflation rate cannot be a finish line, because the economy always go on some dynamic situation, and the uncertainty is lurking. Therefore, the Federal Reserve and the central bank always be prepared to intervene and rein in and adjust interest rate to make the economy as stable as possible. So that means that as long as the net neutral rate of interest remains lower than 2%, then the central bank make efforts to reduce the interest rate as low as possible, as long as it does not trigger the inflation to start again. So to that regard, I think 2% target is not finish line, and last mile is kind of deliver some kind of impression that once we reach there, then everything is solved. No, I don't think so, because still it needs monetary policy remain vigilant and persevere, and also fiscal policy always should be accompanied to help the economy to fit into growing track. That is a very important aspect we have to consider for the central bank.
That's a great point. Now, the Bank of Korea has cited high inflation, like you mentioned, as one of the main reasons for a rate freeze. That's what the central bank says. But some experts point out household debt is also playing a significant role as to why the BOK is leaving the rate unchanged. Professor Song, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I'm a little bit critical of the Bank of Korea's perspective, because in South Korea, the 2022, year over 2022, in July, they have reached the 6.8%, the highest inflation rate. That has been declined and reached the 23 July, they have reached the 2.4%, and there is a slight reflation, and clearly there is a bumpy road for the inflation. But clearly, the overall moving average and the trend of inflation rate is declining. Of course, in the European Union, they have recorded 10% of inflation rate, much higher than us. So to that regard, we don't have to increase the interest rate as much as the European Union or US has increased, but we need to decrease the interest rate to support our economy, to put into the growth rate of the GDP. Otherwise, because the US has enjoyed a very strong economy, growth rate of GDP is very strong. However, in the European Union is very weak, because for recently, just days ago, the France and the other countries, they have reduced the prospect of 2024 GDP growth rate by as much as a half percentage points. So that implies that they need. The reason why the EU has suffered so much from some very slowing economic return or even negative growth rate of the GDP, because they do not use on much of a fiscal policy. They need some expansionary policy, and also interest rate should be adjusted accordingly with the declining of inflation rate.
All right, Professor Song, we appreciate your insight this morning. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
The widow of Alexei Navalny has spoken out, saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin is behind the death of her husband. And the EU and the US are closing in on fresh sanctions against Russia over the death of Navalny. Lee Seung-jae has more.
The widow of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of being responsible for the death of her husband, adding she will continue on with her husband's fight. In an 8-minute video posted on her late husband's social media platforms, Yulia Navalnaya on Monday said the Russian leader killed the father of her children and took away the most precious thing. She further accused Russian authorities of hiding Navalny's body in a move to disguise the cause of his death, adding that they're only waiting for traces of another of Putin's Novichok to disappear, referring to a nerve agent allegedly used by Russia's security service. The EU is now looking into fresh sanctions against Moscow over the death of Putin's critic. Germany, Lithuania, and Sweden were among EU nations calling for specific new penalties against Russia. The discussions came during a meeting of 27 EU foreign ministers scheduled before the death of Navalny, where EU's top diplomat Josep Borrell suggested that Russian prison officials linked to Navalny's death could be added to the list of those subject to asset freezes and travel ban. U.S. President Joe Biden also hinted at new sanctions, while also directly blaming Putin for the death of Navalny.
But the fact of the matter is, Putin is responsible. Whether he ordered it or not, he is responsible for the circumstances that put that man in. And he is a reflection of who he is. And it just cannot be tolerated. I said there would be a price to pay.
Meanwhile, Russia says an investigation into the death of Navalny is underway, adding that all due actions are being taken. The Kremlin added that any accusation against its president is both rude and gross, as there is no information on the cause of death. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Despite initial claims it would veto any UNSC resolutions on a Gaza ceasefire, the U.S. on Monday drafted a resolution calling for a temporary ceasefire in the region. Now, the resolution states a temporary ceasefire would be based on the formula of all hostages being released, while also lifting all barriers to provide humanitarian assistance at scale in the Gaza Strip. The draft also warns Israel not to launch a ground offensive in Rafah, stressing that such major military action should not proceed under the current circumstances. The latest draft comes 2 weeks after an initial draft from Algeria, which demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and was to be put up for a vote on Tuesday. U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield signaled that it would be vetoed, saying it would jeopardize any negotiation talks.
Good morning, I'm Kim Ji-young, and now we turn over to stories from around the world. We begin today at The Hague, where Palestinian representatives on Monday asked the judges at the UN's International Court of Justice to declare Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories illegal. The International Court of Justice began a week of hearings on Monday as a result of the UN General Assembly's 2022 resolution, which called for an advisory, non-binding opinion of the court on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories since 1967. Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki and UN envoy Riyad Mansour said the case may contribute to a two-state solution and a sustainable peace. Al-Maliki, in his speech, argued that Palestinians have suffered from decades of discrimination and apartheid and were left only with the choice of displacement, subjugation, or death. 52 states and 3 organizations, the Arab League, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and Africa Union, will present arguments to the International Court's 15-judge panel until February 26th. Moving over to Indonesia, where at least 71 election workers have died from exhaustion since the world's largest single-day election was held in Indonesia last week. The chairman of the nation's polling body said on Monday that some 4,000 other election workers had taken ill since the February 14th election due to fatigue from helping to run the national event. 5 million paid volunteers worked at some 800,000 polling stations to host the more than 200 million citizens who had registered to cast their votes. While voting lasted for about 6 hours, the post-vote distribution, counting and reporting of paper ballots in some cases lasted over 12 hours. The government had imposed an age cap and mandatory health checks for volunteers after over 500 polling station workers died following the 2019 Indonesian election. Now to Sudan, where a report released on Sunday by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs revealed that some 25 million people, 14 million of them children, require humanitarian assistance due to a violent internal conflict which has passed its 10 months. The civil war between the Rapid Support Forces and Sudanese armed forces has left the population with limited access to medical care. According to the UN Sudan Situation Report, about 65% of the population lacks access to health care, while up to 80% of hospitals in conflict areas are no longer functional. The report also said diseases such as cholera, measles, malaria and dengue fever are claiming Sudanese lives. Now to London Fashion Week, where the catwalk took on literal meaning at the Loving Cats Worldwide's Catstravaganza show. Felines took centre stage at London's Olympia on Sunday, with the UK's most lavish pampered cats carried down the runway by their owners. Steve Miserve, the founder of Loving Cats Worldwide, said that while the event took place during London Fashion Week, we have our own catwalk here and our models are way cuter. Catstravaganza shows are also heading to countries including Canada, Colombia and Japan, as well as cities in the US and the UK.
Good morning. The east of Gangwon-do is on high alert against heavy snowfall, while the rest of the country will see rain. Right now, wet clouds are dropping showers on central regions in Jeolla-Namdo province, which will continue through this afternoon. Then the east coast could see 20 to 60 millimeters of showers. Jeju Island could receive up to 80 millimeters of heavy rainfall. However, the east of Gangwon-do, especially in the mountainous regions, is forecast to see 50 centimeters of blizzards into tomorrow, with a heavy snow advisory issued in the area. So please stay safe. Tomorrow looks to be a snowy one for the central regions and capital area. Morning temperatures are 5 to 10 degrees lower than the same time yesterday. Then highs will also be 2 to 10 degrees lower this afternoon. Seoul gets up to 9 degrees, Busan topping out at only 10 degrees Celsius, which is about 10 degrees lower than yesterday. It will only get chillier as we head into the end of the week, while Jeju Island will be rainy through Sunday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
We thank you for watching New Day at Arirang. We'll be back tomorrow for Wednesday's edition at the same time, 9 a.m. Korea time.